Welcome back to the Becoming Noble podcast. Today I'm truly honored to have Morgoth of Morgoth's Review. For those who don't know, Morgoth is one of the oldest and most influential voices in the scene. He's someone that I've been following probably for close to a decade at this point in various forms. He's an essayist, a cultural critic, and indeed a compelling media critic. He's media literate, as they would say. So I'm really honored to have him here today. Morgoth, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's nice to know that you've been following me for so long. It's been quite the ride, but yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm in an odd position where I was like a passive consumer of yourself and Dave Green, people like that for like, I don't know, at least 5 years before I ever like spoke to any of you. So then you're in the very strange parasocial situation where you're like, hi, I know everything about your thought. I'm just some guy.
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, we've met in real life at a conference about 18 months or so ago, and I remember that. So we've already got a bit of a history, because like a lot of people would think, what does he look like in real life and everything, and like I've actually met more people than people think. I just don't make a big thing of it.
I'm obviously not going to say anything about what you look like, but what I will say is Morgoth looks exactly as you expect him to look like. That's all I'm going to say.
Well, I don't want to get. I might actually just start showing me face because I'm reaching like so old that I'm no longer a threat to the state or anything like that. And I was thinking of just like doing little videos next to me garden, me raised beds, that kind of thing. It's kind of like what am I doing? I'm not planning a revolution. I'm just some bloke with an opinion on the internet at the end of the day. But then again, we are in Starmer's UK, so you never know. You never know.
Yeah, indeed. Let's see how we're doing after this conversation. Let's try and keep this one on rails. But okay, amazing. So, topic for today. I told Morgoth this before the stream, but for those that aren't aware, Amazon has secured a creative monopoly on the James Bond franchise from Eon and the Broccoli family, who are the longtime producers of James Bond, who are very famously quite creatively conservative in their outlook. There's a reason that you haven't seen spin-off TV shows, that they're selective about who directs it, who acts it. They actually have this term apparently called Bondian, which is a sort of sense that certain ineffable qualities feel at home in a James Bond film and certain other ineffable qualities do not. And we can speculate on which ones of those ineffable qualities are actually quite problematic when you identify them. But now Amazon of, the Rings of Power fame has acquired a total creative monopoly over the James Bond franchise. This opens up a very interesting question about James Bond, what James Bond represents, how much you can change James Bond, how much you can depart from that sort of classical Bondian formula, whatever it is, without just producing something that is just unwatchable slop. And I think like probably inevitably we're going to quickly hasten into unwatchable slop territory, but I thought it'd be fun, because I'm English, because Morgoth is English, albeit from different parts of England. We could sort of talk about our understanding of James Bond and then use that as a base to speculate on the future of the franchise. So Morgoth, maybe just to open up the conversation, what's your sort of exposure to James Bond? What is James Bond to you? Have you watched all the films? Have you seen some of them? Have you read any of the books?
Oh yes, I've seen them all many times. I think there's one Timothy Dalton one that I may only have seen once, but basically I'm very familiar with Bond. But Bond used to be on the television, on terrestrial television. If there was a bank holiday Monday or something, you would have a James Bond movie on, and they'd shake it up, and you never knew what you were going to get. And like as I've kind of over the years, I've kind of changed my attitude a little bit, but I've had a soft spot for the Roger Moore Bond always. I like that kind of campy sort of vibe. But then at the same time, I mean, we can get into it all, but they all speak to different eras. But I think growing up and seeing it on the terrestrial television, it's in the blood of the nation. And I think it is kind of strange because Bond is synonymous with sort of British decline in a way. Bond comes in, even the Fleming novels, I think they were in the 1950s, they were written. And so it's always, he comes in at a time where Britain has passed its peak. And I think it was a kind of reflection that, well, okay, we aren't great, don't have the empire anymore, but we're looking for ways which we can represent sort of punching above our weight on the world stage and kind of having prestige. So instead of having the Royal Navy, you would have like the best spy secret agent in the world. And he is technically in the Royal Navy as well. And that's kind of been the trajectory that Bond's been on. But of course, over the years, I think it's become a little bit sort of unhinged. Makes perfect sense in the Cold War, but then when as a backdrop, and then when really with the Brosnan bonds, because the Cold War had ended by then, I think then it becomes a little bit more unworn. And it never even used to be asked that much, like where next for Bond and all this. But then really in the 90s with Brosnan, who was a good Bond, I think this question is still hanging there over the franchise.
Yeah, that kind of nostalgia for an era gone by that is then represented in kind of idealized form in the Bond universe is there right from the beginning. It's actually one of the first things that I think is going to be problematic if Amazon wants to modernize or sort of diversify Bond, as it were, is that kind of the central provocation of Bond, to be a bit tongue-in-cheek, is like, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, wasn't colonialism fun, right? Like James Bond is this fundamentally colonial or at least post-colonial character who sort of romps all over the former empire, still the empire in some places, from Hong Kong to Jamaica, and does so in like particularly Anglo fashion with Anglo colonial attitudes, which focuses on a sort of like genuine curiosity of exploration, an amused but sort of paternalistic superiority, and a sort of delightfully quaint relationship with the locals, which you see in all the films really from Dr. No onwards. But at the same time, this kind of like amused, superior, often unserious, increasingly so as the series went on, approach to things that only makes sense in a world in which Britain's ruling place on the world stage is credible. Like you can't pretend to be above people if you're struggling with sort of Albanian levels of GDP at home. And so like there's this real question, like does the Bond ethos revolves around some extent to this kind of quaint relationship to the British Empire, to colonialism, and then on the other hand, how you're supposed to maintain that in either a world with a diverse Bond or a Britain in decline. It's like a very difficult square to circle.
Yeah, he's and Bond is also like inherently elitist. He was in the backstory is that he supposedly is connected to Scottish nobility, though it's left a little bit vague. Until Skyfall, but he's educated at the best colleges and universities. And when you hear him speak, which is something which is more prominent in sort of Connery and Roger Moore era, it's still there with Timothy Dalton as well. But he knows about art and he knows about literature and he knows about fine wines and champagnes and all of this. So he is an inherently elitist of the elite kind of character. You can even see sort of warped, twisted shades of that mentality in people like Boris Johnson or David Cameron. They come from the same sort of stock. The problem with that is that, as you say, when you get to like the UK, where we are now, like the world of pretty much depressing decay and dilapidation. And I think more fundamentally, and I did a article on this recently, and I'm working on another one now. It is this erasure of boundaries, which is kind of lethal to somebody like James Bond, because in the 1970s, James Bond, Roger Moore was the one like pretty optimistic, pretty light-hearted, but Britain wasn't really doing great in the 1970s at all. There was a lot of problems with unions. There was a lot of unemployment. There was a lot of economic disaster. And yet you could switch on the television and you could still sort of identify with something quintessentially optimistic about the British identity. And I think this comes down to that you can have an economic malaise, but fundamentally you can still be the same people. You can kind of transcend that. But when I think the sort of, as we have now, it's almost like the establishment has been waging war. It's not just a matter of that we're going through a bad patch, but there's been this whole thing, especially, the last 10 or 15 years, where it's as if they've been waging a war on the population. And where does James Bond sort of stand within that frame? I mean, this is where you could look at the Daniel Craig Bonds and how they kind of dealt with that, and some of it, which was a little bit woke and from here to there, but I don't think it was as bad and as egregious as people think. I remember I didn't know that they had this kind of conservative approach to Bond, but I remember being quite pleasantly surprised at the last couple of Daniel Craig ones, because it was kind of like you go in and you think, well, you've seen what's happened to all of the other franchises, and now it's going to be Bond's turn, and it actually wasn't as bad as what I thought it was going to be at all. So in a way, they did kind of deal with that well. It held up well. There's some interesting themes in the Daniel Craig sort of arc that I could get into, but which reflected the age in other ways, though.
They did a good job of, when they had to introduce new characters, when Judi Dench retired and they brought in Ralph Fiennes. Ralph Fiennes was a very believable, again, aristocratic character. I thought it was a very pleasant choice. You can see how they could have gone in a sort of horrific direction with that. With regards to the elitism, Bond's character is fundamentally one which only makes sense in the context of the background presence of the old English aristocracy. Bond has this kind of swagger and haughtiness about him, even in alien, foreign, dangerous settings, that sort of reflects having been born into the aristocratic class of a global empire. And his sort of superior attitude registers as authentic because of that implicit context, that kind of assured cultural superiority. And there's no equivalent now. This is the reason that Americans can't do an American James Bond, that Ethan Hawke or Jason Bourne feels really a whole universe away from James Bond. And that's because they don't have this kind of warlike but refined, culturally refined, mannered aristocracy, which essentially ruled the world for 300 years, that James represents as a kind of avatar of. And it's really difficult to replace that, because the identity bleeds through in a million small but essential ways. I mean, even if you think about how he introduces himself as Bond, James Bond, and that practice of identifying yourself first by your family name is an old English boarding school tradition, which sort of assumes that families of the same class knew each other. Several of my teachers at school called me by my last name. That same line, Bond, James Bond, coming from anyone that doesn't feel like they came from that background, would feel just wrong and faintly ridiculous. And this is that's why the casting is so subtle. Tom Hardy, who's white English, would feel very out of place as Bond, because he doesn't feel culturally mannered and refined. He's a sort of much more aggressively masculine, rugged, working class avatar. At least that's the kind of image he's cultivated for himself in the last decade. Whereas Henry Cavill, or even Robert Pattinson, has that kind of more refined streak to them.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, sort of in terms of class, Tom Hardy is closer to me. And the people that not me particularly, but sort of the people that I grew up with in Tyneside are more closely resemble Tom Hardy than Henry Cavill or Daniel Craig, even though Daniel Craig, I think he is from the north. But yeah, and there's a scene in I think it's Thunderball or somewhere, and I always use it as a kind of example of peak. How can I put this sort of delicately? Sort of civilizational pride relative to other groups, and it's where they step off a boat and they're in Jamaica or somewhere in the Caribbean, and it's just so perfect. he steps off a boat with a woman, and it's to this bar, and they're having cocktails, and you realize like this is really far away from sort of the core of Western civilization, and yet it is completely sort of safe in today's terms and the way we look at things. There's no danger there whatsoever, and as you were saying, it's this inherent superiority, which is, it's really something to see, because you get this sort of guilty pleasure of thinking, well, this is the kind of thing that the left will complain about. Like, it's not nothing. They're not just making it up, but I don't really care that much. As uncomfortable of a thing that is, it's just it is what it is.
I cut you off when you were about to mention, I think, some features of the Craig Bond films that you thought were interesting.
Oh yeah, one of the things I was thinking about in terms of where they will go with the, I mean, because, well, first of all, Amazon have a habit of just making generic slop out of everything. So it could just be awful, it could just be the Rings of Bond. But the what I thought was interesting about the Daniel Craig arc is that in each era of Bond, it does kind of reflect where you have this elitist British character archetype, even, and he is within a certain zeitgeist. So with Sean Connery, it's obviously the Cold War is the big one. It's the Soviet Union, and then you've got Spectre, which is an interesting thing in itself, actually. And then the Cold War carries on quite a bit with Roger Moore, though I think it's lighter tone. And then eventually with Brosnan, you're coming to that collapsing. And then with Craig, but with Brosnan, that there's a new emphasis on, in one of the movies, of media manipulation. I think it's The World Is Not Enough, where Jonathan Pryce is the Bond villain, and he's going to stoke up a war with China.
Tomorrow Never Dies, Mr.
Is it Tomorrow Never Dies? And he's going to stoke up a war with China, between China and the British Navy. I mean, this is in the week that we found out we've got more admirals than ships now in the Royal Navy. And yet just 30 years ago, it was deemed realistic that the British Navy could go toe-to-toe with the Chinese. And he was going to do it all anyway for ratings on his cable television thing. And so you begin to get these new things coming in. It's also in the 90s when you get the emotional Bond, when Judi Dench takes over and she calls Bond, because people tend to think that political correctness is like, it's actually older than what people think. And there's a scene when on the GoldenEye, when Judi Dench is saying, well, you're this anachronistic, misogynistic relic from a bygone era and all of this. And Bond shows emotion. I think he even weeps at one point, and he's got baggage with these different women. Terry Hatcher pops up. He's got baggage with her, and it's like this. The 90s Blair man is now arriving as a Bond figure. But when you get to Daniel Craig, who is the most Tom Hardy-like of the Bonds so far, I think, what I thought was fascinating was that in the backdrop to the stories was a kind of almost like a critique of the World Economic Forum, these sort of cynical climate change agendas where somebody will buy up a lake in Bolivia and it's all, but you can sit in, it's the Davos man, where you can sit in Vienna and some little Alpian town, and you can organize the heist. You can do like a kind of climate change philanthropic swindle and pump it towards your real job, which is collecting data from intelligence services to blackmail governments with, or and they keep sort of doing this. Where another in the Daniel Craig arc, Spectre comes back, and it's got its tentacles into all of these government agencies. And at one point, they want to abolish the 007, the MI6 altogether, and turn it into this kind of where you've just got some, it's outsourced. So it's like this public-private partnership deal. And you'll have like a 22-year-old kid sitting in San Francisco with a computer, and he will then become the British security services. And all of this is again a swindle, and it's all Spectre doing it. And I always thought that was very good and very interesting, and there was so much of it in there. And by the time you get to Skyfall, they kind of go back to basics, and he gets no gadgets. I think he gets like the old like transmitter thing from one of the Connery things, and it's all about going back into the wilderness of Scotland in the old car. It's coming full circle, going off grid and getting away from technology, which obviously that just sinks to my soul completely, and I thought it was wonderful. And the reason why I bring all of this up to do with the technology and whatnot is because when we're heading towards now talking about where they're going to take this in the future, obviously all of the stuff that was themes in the Daniel Craig Bond are still with us now. But then you've also got like AI coming towards us, and what are the implications of that in the context of a James Bond storyline kind of thing? I can think of all kinds of things. But really what I think is interesting for where we're going in this post-woke age is, would it be possible to have, despite everything that I've just said about technology and Spectre and whatnot, would it be possible to have because look, let's get straight to it, the perfect Bond villain at large today, if you want to reflect the zeitgeist that you're in, is Elon Musk. But the problem with that is when the culture sort of war will dictate like your friend, enemy, how are you going to look at that? How would the MAGA base see that if next year there was a big Amazon bond drop, and it was obvious that the American government's been hijacked by this tech billionaire with a sinister agenda and this kind of populist blowhard, real estate mogul and all this. And I find that it would ask a lot of the populist right to take a step back and kind of critique itself. They'd immediately see that as an attack. They would immediately think, hang on a minute, the movies are still woke. We thought we were past all of that. And yet I do think that should happen, because that would be the most nuanced, that in a way that does speak to the age that we're living in. I do want to know where they're going with all this. I do want to see that smug look taken off Musk's stupid face a little bit. But in all likelihood, of course, the Bond character would be chasing after people like me and you rather than that.
Yeah, as he tears into Musk, it's for King and Keir Starmer, Mr. Musk, and then
for King and Keir.
But no, I mean, I think you've identified a real problem, which is that those trends which have made the Daniel Craig series compelling, because they've sort of opened up this new angle of both skepticism of the establishment that Craig and Bond is trying to be, is nominally a servant to, and then also this kind of return to basics where he's driving the old Aston Martin through the hills of Scotland and he's fighting people with shotguns and no gadgets. Those things they feel to me like developments that can temporarily breathe life into a franchise, but can't be explored too far because they would start to undermine the foundations. I mean, because, Bond, if you think about his loyalty too hard, if you start questioning his loyalty to country, you very quickly end up in a bad place, because Bond is kind of pathologically willing to give himself and die for his country, for Queen and country, James. And if it's actually quite an interesting contrast, if you look at, for example, Jason Bourne, that series, and some of the Mission Impossible series as well, there's a strong contrast. So James Bond, he serves his country and he combats the villain, and the villain historically is an outsider, a foreigner, usually one with some kind of sexual dysfunction and deformed foreign henchman. Whereas Jason Bourne is like fighting against his own state, right, against his own agency, which has become corrupted or in some way. And in Bond, you have a very problematic streak in the kind of like historic catalog of Bond villains, in that if you actually look at the villains that Fleming creates, they're mixed race, and that's like integral in Fleming's mind to their like twisted characters, which have caused them in their kind of like schizophrenic identity to do crazy things. Like, you know, Hugo Drax is, I think is Prussian, LARPing as an English, he's German, LARPing as an Englishman. And then you obviously have Dr. No, who's half white and half Asian, Blofeld, Le Chiffre, who's half Jewish and half European. So it's like, this is like a big thing for Fleming, is this notion that like very dangerous to start mixing the peoples. But Bond, the Brit, you know, who has this solid identity as an Englishman, as an aristocrat, or at least as a Brit, as an aristocrat, has this like absolute love and loyalty to the death for the country, and it doesn't need to be explained. It's a given for the audience. This is some sort of like knightly aristocratic noblesse oblige, but that's all kind of gone now. That whole logic that props that thing up and makes it unquestionable, exactly as you say, in the age of Tomorrow Never Dies, the age of conspiracy theories, the age of unpopular elites. It's quite difficult to see what he's supposed to be so selflessly and pathologically fighting for in the same way. That establishment has faded, if not disappeared. And now it's much more, you know, that whole life path is not something that the veterans of World War II did. They went out, they died for their country, and the ones that survived, like Bond, just, you know, held on to for the rest of their lives. Now it's a much more sort of calculated, CV-driven decision to join these various factions and to take this thing on. So, like, as soon as you start delving deeper into the very interesting seam that they uncovered with Daniel Craig and his sort of betrayal by different parts of the British establishment, you scratch beneath the surface too far, and suddenly you reveal that like the whole logic of Bond is kind of broken by the age we're in.
Yeah, I mean, even in the Daniel Craig Bonds, especially through Fiennes' character, there was a certain reverence for the Prime Minister and the upper levels of government in the cabinet. Ralph Fiennes is a far more prime ministerial, if that's a word, character or man than Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Boris Johnson is. Like, if Ralph Fiennes was the Prime Minister of Britain right now, I'd probably be quite happy. but what we've got is far inferior to him, who plays a sort of bureaucrat in this. But the reverence that they have for the Prime Minister is unquestioned, and there's a kind of implied tradition. You'll notice in the offices, even in the more recent ones, Daniel Craig ones, they don't look like Globo Homo offices. They're these old, like nice heavy oak desks, and they've got lots of old hardback books on the shelves. Like, it's all of it is an appeal to this sort of Harry Potter style tradition, but set within a spy world. And what you will find instead, so they don't trample on the toes of what keeps the country worth defending. The institution of the Prime Minister's office is never compromised. He's always doing a good job on behalf of the King or the Queen. That'll never be questioned. Whereas I think you're right. When the Americans do this, it's kind of like, yeah, the rot goes all the way to the top. Instead, what happens with James Bond is that it gets outsourced. There'll be a rogue agent here or there, and he'll have been wronged by the bureaucracy, or it'll be a department of the bureaucracy has been compromised by the, like in Skyfall with, I forgot his name now, the one that takes his teeth out and all of that. And so the structure, the whole remains solid. It's there and it deserves to be defended. Whereas this is difficult to kind of think of now in where everything's so decayed and everything is so, where do you take Bond? This, I think, is one of the reasons why there was talk about doing it all the way back in the 60s. As if to say, like, well, we don't know what we don't know how to deal with the present. We don't know what the ever fluctuating sort of cultural war sentiment is, or the geopolitical situation now, which, I mean, that I would at least say was set to a certain degree, even if you think of it as James Bond's going to be on the side of global homo. We don't even know whose side global homo's on now. Will Felix Leiter be like cast as a Rush, sort of too friendly with the Russians, or who even are our friends and all of this kind of thing? What I think's interesting as well is because Bond has to maintain at least the veneer of a kind of idealized British government and state, is that you can go back to another spy series, which is the John le Carre novels, stuff like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and you can see that the main character in it, they all of them are thoroughly depressed and disillusioned spies. I forgot who the main. It's George Smiley. George Smiley is the main spook, and he's like sort of an anti-Bond. And all of the action will take place in these chip shops where, with a cup of tea, and it's all, the wallpaper's falling off the walls. Everything's corrupt. Nothing is worth kind of believing in, to the degree where in a lot of the John le Carre spy novels, Tinker Tailor, I think, the one in particular, it's that the reason why you get these departments and these veterans in the agency going rogue, the assumption is, well, they're all secret Marxists, and it turns out they aren't. What they are is agents who've been around since the Second World War. It's set now in the 60s and in the 70s, and they're so disgusted with what's happening in the post-war order that they feel like they just want to help the Marxists out. They feel like they want to sell secrets to the Soviet Union, not because they're Nazis or communists or Marxists. They're actually these kind of reactionary old Tories. They're these old-fashioned sort of conservative Englishmen who are just absolutely disgusted. When there's a part where George Smiley's walking across the cliffs of Dover, and he has this monologue with his wife about how they gave it all away, and how when one of them gets caught and he's in jail, and Smiley says, why did you do it? You had a good career, the pension was sorted. You notice it's all this, everything's kind of mundane. And he said, because I just couldn't live with the fact that we'd become America's streetwalker, America's prostitute after the war. It disgusted me. That's why I did it. That's why I betrayed the country, because the country wasn't worth dying for. It wasn't. I just didn't believe in it anymore. And I find that that's the kind of, I mean, James Bond would never go near that territory, but you think it in some way it has to kind of acknowledge that there's this kind of sentiment in the country and has been there for a long time. And now, you see this thing where it's like, we can't get people to sign up to, go off and fight the Russians. We can't get people to join the army. Everybody's just completely disillusioned. That's a thing. That's a thing. Or is it that where James Bond becomes like this big cope, and we pretend that it just isn't the case, which would strike me as being more dishonest than in the 70s when we put Roger Moore on for a laugh and ignored that the bins hadn't been collected or that the unions were on strike again, that kind of thing.
Le Carre's work is like, it acknowledges something real that happened in that time, that Bond, as you say, that universe is never acknowledged. So for American listeners who may not be as familiar with the history, one of the worst spies ever within the British establishment was called Kim Philby, who was a member of what were called the Cambridge Five. And They, from the 1930s onwards, infiltrated the most sensitive parts of the British establishment and passed a lot of very high level information to the Russians. And one of the reasons they were able to do this, even though at a certain point it was obvious that these particular figures must have been the culprits for this, was that it was just assumed that, good upper crust Cambridge boys would never betray the country. They were one of us. They were the part of the elite. And that revelation that in fact some of them had was culturally crushing to the institution, and brought about a set of paranoias about identity and an uneasiness with who qualified and who didn't, and who could be loyal and who couldn't. And it was a sort of real cultural watershed moment. But Bond has kind of never acknowledged that. The nice thing about Bond is you're led to believe that it's a bit like Kingsman or something. There's this nice sharply dressed part of Britain that you never see, that are very refined, very effective, and in a wood paneled room somewhere, they're really they're protecting us, and we're safe because of them. And there's none of that anxiety. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very difficult for the Bond Amazon project to know where to take that. I mean, I was listening just on the way here. I had 10 minutes and I was listening to an interview with a guy that's part of the broader business. And he said, they're seeing a lot of demands for a return to the 50s or 60s, to do a kind of Man from U.N.C.L.E. style vintage Bond going back to classics. He said the problem is they can't do that because Bond is essentially at this point an entirely constructed around being a vehicle for product placement. So you'll see, Ford Fiestas in the latest Bond film, as well as, Omega watches, the clothes, Olive Bar Brown, all of this, everything you see is curated to be the latest product that a particular company wants to sell. So you can't do that if they go back to the 1950s and they're using gear that no one can use anymore. So they for business reasons, for the slopification reasons, they can't go back. So then there's this question of like, what do you do? How do you keep Bond in the present or the future feeling like Bond while remaining somewhat believable or relevant? And it's very difficult to do because, as you say, like maybe just about you can believe that Daniel Craig and his manager, whichever room they're in, it looks as nice as the kind of ministerial rooms that you see in Spectre, which are sort of very luxurious and Whitehall type inlaid woods and so forth. But I mean, how long can that go on? At what point does this sort of depart into a sort of alternate history of what Britain could have been? Kind of Bridgerton-like cultural artifact in which, like, the aesthetics, in order to be luxurious, to feel luxurious, are just totally divorced from the substance of what is attempting to be portrayed. And this is already like you can feel this like aesthetic tension creeping into the Craig films, because Craig never he never comes across as quite comfortable as the clothes he's in. He always looks like a little bit self-conscious. On the whole, he was very good, but he looked a bit unnatural in the clothes. They were always like a bit too tight, a bit too starched, and a bit like over the top. And he never looked like someone that was comfortable in them. Few actors can look totally at home, like sell to the audience. They are totally at home in like those refined clothes. And someone like Roger Moore, who was, and Sean Connery as well, both of them former actors, they can do it. But, people who don't come from that very particular part of the British strata, they look uncomfortable, or they look like they're kind of peacocking, like they're overly proud of how spiffy they look, overly self-aware. I used to live briefly next to a sort of high-end tailor, but a high-end tailor that specifically catered to footballers, rappers, these kind of things. And it was kind of horrendous because like the quality of the tailoring was probably quite high, but like nothing looked natural because people would try and cram their clothes into every photograph they were taking while they were getting fitted, rather than like it being a natural extension of themselves. And this is only going to get worse. And like the UK, where no one's wearing suits anyway, because Bond is, and this is under-recognized now, if you go back to the early Bonds, he's actually frequently underdressed for a scene. He's not overdressed like Daniel Craig's Bond. He's wearing a Submariner with a dinner jacket, and that's a statement that he's not just comfortable, a little bit hard-edged, like he's bringing some tooling, some of the tricks of the trade to these very luxurious settings. All of that is like very, I don't know. It's so easy for that to go off the rails and just feel like totally fantasy fake. At which point, this kind of like British soft power portrayal will lose all its weight and utility.
Yeah, you get the sense with Sean Connery in particular that his body mass has been built up by like shifting iron girders and building ships on a Glaswegian shipyard. And Daniel Craig's obviously like a gym bro. And I mean I don't want to like open up a can of worms there, but there is a difference. There is a difference. But I do think it's interesting what you were talking about, where you know that Derrida thing, hauntology, where instead of getting Britain like as it is, or that we can identify with in any way, because you could in the past, if you look at Timothy Dalton's Bond, the Britain that you saw in the backdrop was kind of just Britain. It was just realistic. It was the story that was Bond. The rest of it, there wasn't much work needed to be done. Even the Brosnan, even some of the Craig ones, you know, London was just London. But it's going to get to a point where you get this hauntology thing where it's a vision of a potential Britain that could have been but wasn't. So it's a kind of stillbirth or a lingering there, like vaporwave or cyberpunk or what these other forms that didn't catch on to the degree that they should have done, but they're still there. Today, there was a thing came out where a portrait of Lord Nelson had been taken down and replaced with a picture of Yvette Cooper. And it just like, I mean, it wasn't, I could understand, and she's a serving politician in her 50s. And I could understand it if it was like St. Stephen Lawrence or something. I could understand it if it was some celebrated icon of diversity and inclusion, you know, whatever. I wouldn't approve of it, of course, but I could get where they were coming from. But it's getting to the point where they're actually just sitting Labour politicians are removing the portrait and paintings of like legendary figures of British history and replacing them with themselves while they're still in office. How does James Bond deal with that? And James Bond would have to exist in a world where that did not happen. You can't have James Bond exist in a world where they take down Lord Nelson's photo to put it up for some Labour bureaucrat who is still in office and has never achieved anything. I just find it the two completely incompatible. So yeah, I think you're right. They will have to create an idealized form of Britain which does not actually exist, but could have existed if it wasn't for like gay race communism and or the UKification of the country. So we will have this complete detach from reality, which obviously people are going to say, well, you know, James Bond is obviously not real. But no, it isn't. But, you know, there was, you could relate to it and you could still see elements of Britain. Not everywhere was like an Oxfordshire with a little boat where you could lie having a picnic with some nurse having a smooch. That's true. But there's degrees of, there's a kind of elasticity. And I just don't believe that you can do that in Bond now. The way the UKification and Bond are just incompatible. You can't have the two together. And so what you will have is something which is even more dangerous for the regime, because if you imagine the demographic, let's say, of young white British men who they want to conscript from places like Merseyside and Teesside and Middlesbrough, Yorkshire, it's always them areas in the adverts. Well, they're going to look at Bond and think, why doesn't the country actually look like that? What went wrong? Why is it that we can't have Britain as it looks in James Bond? So you may get an actual sort of MI5 or MI6 agent as a kind of overseer somebody from the nudge department will be like looking at what's being put in the film and whether or not that's going to be dangerous to the British government because it might give the wrong message. It might be subversive to the regime because the regime is in such a bind at how bad things are, you know?
It's I've got like an image in my mind where, like Bond is talking to M, and M is saying, Bond, you have to stop. You've given everything. You're on the verge of death. And Bond says, not everything, not yet. And then just over M's shoulder, you see a picture of Dawn Butler on the wall. But yeah, no, you're totally. There might be a really interesting future here because we're sort of like assuming, and I think this is the most realistic trajectory, which is that, because all the evidence so far is that Amazon buys things, Disney buys things, they turn them into slop, and I'm sure we'll see like spin-off series, Moneypenny spin-off series, and just like nightmares beyond your comprehension. But there is a funny example where everyone's up in arms in that there's now an American company that owns the creative rights to James Bond. However, America is getting radically more conservative, and the billionaires are cozying up to Trump and his sort of anti-DEI crusade at a time when the British establishment is not. And so exactly as you say, there's a sort of funny potential outcome here where Bond's portrayal is increasingly embarrassing for British elites because it sort of heightens the contrast between the world of Bond and the world that we see on the streets every day. And the elites are totally unable, the British elites are totally unable to rein that in because, Jeff Bezos has decided it's a personal project for him to make sure that we're making the best possible Bond we can. And it's like he's going all in on full-blown
Yeah. There was something came out today, I think it was, or recently, where Jeff Bezos said, well, the Washington Post is going to focus its letters page on liberty and economic freedom. These kind of classic American sort of, this is what we're about. And so, yeah, he may do an intervention and he, like a couple of text messages or a WhatsApp, like what do they call it? A workshop where they say, we want the least woke James Bond ever. Like we want the absolute best representation of the British Bond. He loves Queen, he loves country, and all of this. He's not going to have any of this politically correct mumbo jumbo. And the British government and the intelligence services themselves may be like, whoa, wait a minute, that's going to bring down, that's going to cause a constitutional crisis in the UK. It's crazy. It's crazy where we find ourselves. I mean, if I was approached, because I do like to think about, like, I have a whole idea in my head about what would be the perfect sort of movie for MAGA. I would remake Cannonball Run, and I figured out which famous celebrities could be in there, and it would be all about healing the divisions in America and all of this kind of thing. And I think if somebody approached me and said, well, you have to come up with like a pitch for a Bond sort of thing, which is gonna keep the British government happy and Jeff Bezos, and it's not going to be woke, I would probably make it quite minimalist, and I would have it almost all set in like strange places. Like I think I would have a lot of it in, I would put some of it in maybe like India, and it would be, like you'd have a MacGuffin where there was it's difficult to have MacGuffins these days because everything's just instantly across the internet. But, like a memory stick or something like that, if that would still be allowed. You can see like I'm total Gen X Luddite with technology, but, there's some form of MacGuffin and Bond has to seek it out in India. The problem there, of course, is that you've got the Empire problem. You're running into post-imperialism straight away. Is that going to trigger everybody? That I think that's what I would try to go. Lots of scenic locales. Just try and keep them out of Britain as much as possible. So you can't actually, so you're not actually going to run the hazard of reality breaking in through the narrative. There's always has to be a point where he touches base in London. That's the problem. Unless you have it, like M pops up in a submarine off in the Indian Ocean or something like that. But thankfully, I don't have to write the script. I mean, I don't know.
You could do one where Donald Trump tried to block the selling of the Chagos Isles, and Bond has to stop him. We have to give away our property.
Yeah, yeah. I don't even know what's going on with that.
It's like I like you enjoy coming up with, film scripts, or just like theoretically that I would write, and it is like it's a kind of unsolvable problem, which is why I wanted to have this discussion. Retaining the heart of Bond in the era we're moving into is so difficult because every part of that is just kind of falling apart. Like, what identity is he supposed to convey? British values now, we're told, are tolerance and so forth. So you can't really have him portraying British values, because that's slightly be an uninteresting Bond film. Where's he supposed to go? As you say, like anywhere outside the Empire is like typically not that interesting because it doesn't feel relevant to Britain. Anywhere inside the Empire, the former empire, feels problematic and shrinking. And because of the internet, like a lot of these places just fundamentally feel less exotic. Like if you go back to what really made Bond popular, the books themselves weren't bestsellers straight away. And in the books, it's quite terse. Like there's not a lot of humor. And one of the genius insights of the producers of the films in casting Connery, who had a certain sort of like working class credential and appeal, and then putting a lot of humor into it, and then, really, really leaning into the luxurious aspect, was you created something that was very appealing to the British working class as a kind of idealized version of what, the elites must be up to. The problem is now with the internet, we kind of know what India's like. And I've been to India a few times, and it is like that. I had some wonderful experiences and met some wonderful people, but the whole thing's a bit less like, the world's a lot smaller now, and coming up with these realistic exotic locales. And you kind of feel this in the last few films. Like, I don't know, there was at least one film with Christopher Waltz, I forget which one it was, where he's just in some kind of concrete block in a desert and they're running around, and it's just not, it's not interesting, or it has no world feel. It's just a place. It's just a kind of brutalist place. It doesn't whisper to you that there's a seductive world out there that you're not aware of, that only the most dangerous men in Britain get access to, because you know how small the world is and you know how boring a lot of those men are. And it's just like, it's so difficult to magic into existence some kind of, I mean, the one saving grace, going back to your geopolitical point, is that in the last 2.5 years, tensions with Russia have really escalated. And maybe there's something you could do with the Russia situation. But the problem is that like during the Cold War, you could do Russian bad guys because they weren't really trying to wind down the Cold War and try and dampen tensions and, calm the European security situation. Now that at least seems to be the direction the Trump administration is trying to go in. So kind of inflammatory Russo phobic rhetoric is probably not going to land that well with the establishment. So it's so difficult. It's so difficult. Normally I'm quite good at thinking these things up, but I'm really struggling on this one.
Yeah, and it's like, as I said, in the Cold War, if you said something, if you had a Connery Bond and it was from 1966, the Cold War was kind of settled. You knew there was like literally a wall in the middle, and then there was all kinds of sort of cat and mouse games going on with spy agencies. It's a bit difficult to do that because, well, the lines, there's much less certainty, and it seems to change with the news cycle. I mean, I've been thinking recently, I haven't sort of fleshed this out very much, but it has occurred to me recently that a lot of the kind of big players in the world have actually been sort of radicalized by the internet. Like there's an assumption that we plebs have to watch out that we're in echo chambers, and we have to like, for example, I'll deliberately listen to sort of mainstream leftist takes on what's going on now with, say, Russia and Ukraine and Trump and the European Union. I will genuinely try to get a feel for all sides of the different discussion. But one of the things I think is interesting is that maybe some of the like most influential people in the world are kind of in echo chambers. And I certainly feel that way, well, obviously about Elon Musk, but also maybe about Trump or Tucker Carlson or these kinds of figures. Like, are they above being stuck in these sort of silos of just the same opinions all the time? I don't think they are. And this may be an angle for a Bond sort of saga of truth and what is truth and how do we get to the truth, because this is becoming more and more acute, and it's easy to forget that if you perceive it that your side has won, then that's great. Then you can forget that was a discussion people were having 6 months ago, because it's convenient that now you think you're winning. So, well, now everything we say is just true. And I think you could get into that. It would be a bit of a mind-bending thing, and it would be a bit of a shift for a Bond character. But the idea of false narratives and sort of post-truth era would be something that you could maybe do with a Bond in some way. It was kind of touched on earlier with Jonathan Pryce, with the media empire, and kind of like but in that case, it was where you would just manipulate the masses through cable television, and you could do something similar, but again, you're going to end up with somebody like Elon Musk being the main protagonist of the saga. I mean, funny enough, that's something that the British government might be quite happy with, but Jeff Bezos and the Americans wouldn't. So we're in this bad situation.
I've got nothing more. We're about to hit the hour mark. I think we've solved the problem.
Yeah,
And
I mean,
looking forward to the next James Bond film.
It's a shame that they won't be going back to the 60s, because that's usually a bit of a cop-out to dial back. I think that the idea of taking Bond back to the 60s it's like a clever trick to get out from under the woke stuff, because you can say, yeah, well, we all know it was a bit more racist and a bit more white and a bit more sexist back in the 60s. That's not our fault. That's just the way it was. And it's a kind of sleight of hand to get around being too woke. But if you say if that's no longer possible, yeah, they're left with the crisis of Bond's identity in the world where everything is in flux all of the time. There's not even in the sort of the peak global homo age, Daniel Craig's Bond managed to do it. I mean, people will probably say it was one of the worst Bonds or whatever, but it's still recognizably a James Bond entry. I don't know where they're going to go from here. Even the technology stuff has been played out because of the Daniel Craig one. That's already been done in the previous sort of story arc. So where they're going to go with this? To finish, I would say keep it small and limited, almost like a murder mystery or something like that, with some excellent action scenes in. But that's not what Hollywood does these days. But that's what I would do. And you could also bring back that kind of elitist veneer, especially with Cavill. Pitch it to a high intelligence audience. You go overboard on references. If you set it in Italy, go overboard on references to the Renaissance and Italian history and this kind of thing. So it would be a little bit like the Hannibal, which was set in where was that set now? Florence, I think it was. And you got Hannibal sort of sniffing truffles and all of that kind of thing, but they won't, because it's not slop. They don't want high status. They don't want anything elitist. So even if they do make it non-woke, it'll be sort of non-woke but slop, which is kind of what a lot of the MAGA movement is, I'm afraid.
Morgoth, thank you so much. Where can people find you?
Morgoth Review on Substack and on Twitter and on YouTube. So thank you very much for having me.
Thanks, folks. See you next time. To unlock premium episodes, as well as over 100 essays and other benefits, go to becomingnoble.substack.com/audio for an exclusive 10% discount for podcast listeners. That's becomingnoble.substack.com/audio. Enjoy.